Good morning, everyone, and welcome to BDO's webinar on preparing your business to respond to the coronavirus. My name is Mark Cushing. I'm a partner in advisory at BDO in Brisbane. My major focuses are on government and the NFP sector, primarily in health, disability and aged care. And I also lead the strategy and transformation components of the business, looking at strategic planning, optimizing and transforming your services, but also, which is really important for today's topic, is business continuity, disaster recovery and crisis planning. I have with me my colleague Joe, and I'll just hand over to Joe to make his introductions.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Joe Okino. I'm an Associate Director in the advisory practice at BDO. My areas of focus as far as sector is around government and healthcare in particular. I'm also part of the people advisory practice. So in that space, I work a lot in the areas of strategic workforce planning, workforce transformation, talent, and organizational design. So in today's webinar, I'll be covering off a lot of the people elements of the work.
So you can see the agenda on your screens today. So we're going to have a look at the current state of the coronavirus, what are the current numbers and where we're at. And we're also going to look at response considerations, our framework around key areas of looking at your sustainability, looking at your supply chain, the health and safety, and the most important element that Joe sort of alluded to was around the people and also technology. We also have an opportunity to provide questions and answers through today's webinar, so feel free to submit questions during that session. Any questions that we don't get to today, we'll respond to over the coming days. So the first slide there is around the current state, and you'll likely seen graphs showing the impacts on the uncontrolled transmission of the coronavirus on the health system. Experts are talking about activities to flatten out that curve and to reduce the impact on our health systems. However, when we all have a role to play, so this requires businesses to come up with strategies and look at ways in which that they can manage and mitigate some of those impacts over the longer period. Because you can see in normal disasters like floods or cyclones, the recovery time is much shorter, but with a pandemic like coronavirus, we're looking at a much longer period of working in a sort of unfamiliar situation. So the next slide is really about our focus. So our focus for today is on looking at the coronavirus through a number of different channels. Oh, sorry, I haven't moved forward. So the areas that we're looking at are sustainability, our supply chain, our people, technology and health and safety, which I talked about through the agenda. But business continuity planning is a critical function for any organisation. These things are going to be looking at the potential implications to the workforce around your labour, your productivity, your supply chain and collaboration. And COVID is really impacting across all industries. The major difference which we talked about around COVID-19, around the floods and cyclones, is that we're going to have to work in an area that limits the impact, but also helps us speed up our recovery. So when we look at sustainability, it's the area of the business that we're understanding what is most important to your business and what you need to do to prioritise and plan and recover. We'll then focus on some supply chain, so identify those vulnerabilities in impacts to ascertain all those risks around recovery. We'll have a little bit of a focus on technology as well, so we'll be looking at maintaining collaboration, productivity and security during that event. Joe is going to spend a fair bit more time on the people piece around understanding those critical roles, those employees that are fulfilling and doing roles within your workforce that are critical to the delivery of your services or maintaining your business. And then we're also going to touch on the health and safety elements around developing a plan that ensures a safe working environment for all staff and visitors and anyone that engage with your business. So the first area that I'd like to focus on is the sustainability elements. And these are really important around prioritising your functions according to those that will obviously impact operational viability, impact your financial viability, and cause significant reputational damage to your business. So when prioritising the functions, we've identified 4 key areas for you to consider in your business continuity planning around sustainability. The first one is around your critical teams. These are the teams that perform critical functions, and without them, the business cannot survive. All your business continuity planning needs to consider what actions you will take to protect those critical teams and ensure that you have a plan in place to isolate them from others in your business. We want to be able to reduce the likelihood of COVID-19 exposure on your business. So for example, some of our clients that we've been working with are looking at splitting teams into two and having them operate in different locations. Another area to focus on with your business continuity planning around sustainability is your materials. Consider those resources outside of the cash and people that must be maintained to achieve operational and financial viability. Another key area is your financial management. So this area focused on the potential to cause significant reputational damage, particularly given the widespread media reporting surrounding companies which are currently underpay or potentially underpaying employees. The critical functions of financial management that you should be considering is prioritizing your cash flow. So prioritizing a list of costs that can be eliminated if necessary. Consider refinancing your debt arrangements to take advantage of the lower interest rates which are on offer. Look at your employee remuneration. That will determine how well you build trust with employees, and focus on paying employees with their benefits in a timely manner. Benefits are really important at the moment because obviously with stimulus packages and grants coming from government, keep an eye on those things to make sure that you can take advantage of those incentives, but also payroll tax relief packages which are coming out. And that sort of landscape is changing on a daily basis as governments try to respond to the economic impacts. And then the final bit when you're looking at the sustainability of your organisation from a business continuity planning perspective is your processes. There's probably two elements that you need to focus on primarily, and that's your operational process and your administrative process. But with the operational process, they should be assessed in terms of revenue generating. What are the things that are likely going to keep your business afloat moving forward? Looking at your service delivery model and what services you're delivering that are essential to community. Your reputational risks are going to be exposed around your operational processes, so try and maintain and I suppose manage your reputational risk of your business. The administrative processes are really about planning for the immediacy around the effect on your workforce. So those leaves and benefits entitlements that are sort of changing at the moment. Have a response and a plan in place to maintain confidence with your staff. It's really important as leaders within your business to reduce stress and ensure the mental health is maintained of your staff, and administrative processes that get put in place really go a long way to doing that. The admin side is often forgot about when you're doing business continuity planning, but it's really the most critical in terms of your workforce. Now, if we focus on supply chain. First and foremost, you should be identifying your key direct suppliers and understand what their abilities are to meet the requirements for your business. Gaining visibility on suppliers, the inventory, the production, the ability to fill purchases is going to be key. Working with key suppliers to understand what flexibility and arrangements they have in place and how they're monitoring and responding to Corona is really important as well. And try and understand where you sit from an allocation perspective in the event of any potential shortages. Understanding alternate sources of supply. Look to activate secondary sources of supply specifically for critical inventory that you need to run your business. Consider increasing supply orders to improve safety, stock numbers, and to cope with unexpected supply closures and impacts. Developing contingency plans for alternate suppliers will become pertinent during recovery if your suppliers have not fared well during this crisis. The likelihood of COVID-19 creating supply chain impacts is guaranteed. It's going to happen. These effects are already being seen in companies where China is a direct supplier. But regardless whether China is within your direct supply chain or not, the chances of this ripple effect around supply chain is going to occur. Therefore, supply chain vulnerabilities should be assessed to identify those high-risk gaps. Impacts need to be assessed to determine the overall risks and what measures need to be enacted to minimise vulnerabilities identified and facilitate a strong recovery. We've tried to simplify that supply chain risk down into 4 key areas for you to consider. 4 key areas, as you can see, are production, cash, labour, supply and demand. In relation to production, if the supply is limited, then you need to determine how long you can continue with your current raw materials and supplies that you have. What are your options to source more materials? and can you prioritise production to limit those impacts? In the case of determining if there's what you need to do around a break-even production, have a look at those and commence managing suppliers to reduce the rate of production. Your cash. Determine what cash reserves are required to support the business if supply is reduced. Cash reserves will be significant to maintaining ongoing expenses, especially when you're going to have a reduced operational output. Your labour component, and Joe, once again, will be spending a little bit more time on this, but you really need to be starting to think about the impacts of a reduced operational output is going to have on your workforce and how that can be managed effectively to maintain your reputation and your brand in the community. Ultimately, if operations require the supply of labour, then how can that supply be maintained and transported, and looking at all the effects around that labour. Your supply and demand is the last area, starting to identify alternate means of achieving that critical supply, and importantly, communicating to clients and your customers what the likely delays might be and to be expected. And you also need to be making sure that you've got those measures in place around communication to maintain your brand's reputation. Another key element is technology. Technology is going to be a critical enabler to now allow organisations to collaborate through this period of uncertainty. However, during this same period, cyber threats are likely to take advantage of your organisations, and we're already starting to see that with some of our clients that we speak to on a daily basis. And also, with your employees working at home, there's a number of easy exploitable attack vectors for various threats, and it's not just external threats, but also considering internal threats to your organisation need to be considered. We would recommend you focus on 6 key areas around your technology. These areas are alerts, remote working, connectivity and bandwidth, and collaboration, also single points of failure in technology, and bring your own device. I'd just like to bring this back to alerts and what we mean by that. So with alerts, you need to look at developing and obtaining communication platforms and multiple channels, so email, SMS, Skype, Teams, Microsoft Teams, other channels to actually have communication channels open for staff to use. Ensuring all staff can be kept informed and be prepared to use multiple channels. Remote working, ensuring that security considerations are being taken into account, and when staff remotely access work systems and networks, and staff will also need to be provided with required technology to support that role. And I guess Joe will also talk a little bit more around remote working from a health and safety perspective as well. Connectivity and bandwidth. So working locations are generally set up with specific connections and bandwidth to perform critical business functions. Your considerations need to be given to whether employees will have the required connection and bandwidth to limit and perform their role from a home environment. So you'll need to be considering things like the security implications of the consumer grade hardware and software and the commercial routers and firewalls, where I guess connectivity, but also security issues can be an issue. Technology is going to be a key enabler for collaboration. And the 3 considerations that we would recommend is that you obviously need to be providing those employees that you have with the required technology to collaborate. You need to be able to make sure that your employees are trained to use that collaboration technology. And you also need to be looking at how the employees access information to perform their role. So can they get access to network drives and particular files and applications to perform their tasks in a home office environment. The other part of the framework that you've got there is the single points of failure. So just for businesses that are just relying on email for communication, you need to be probably thinking about alternate ways to mitigate that risk, looking at other file sharing collaboration opportunities, because if email fails and it's your only point of communication, that could be a challenge to stay connected with your workforce. There will be an increased pressure placed on connectivity, so the network and the bandwidth, and that will need to be managed and monitored to reduce that stability issue. Bring your own device, allowing unknown devices to access the network and the technology applications will introduce risk to your business. So considerations need to be given to what security measures are going to be put in place to reduce the threats of BYOD. Organisations need to start considering how allowing staff to access sensitive information or personally identifiable information from a BYOD device at home and manage those appropriately, because obviously there's liabilities under the Privacy Act and the general data protection regulations that are in place. So at this point in time, I've got a lot of the elements in the framework discussed and completed, but I might hand it over to Joe to talk about the more important parts of the business.
Thanks for that, Mark. And just following on what Mark's been going through, if you would like more information, we're following our risk response checklist, which you can find on the BDO Australia website, where there's more examples and checklists and ideas for you to consider in addition to what Mark shared here today so far. So I'm going to be covering off on health and safety and people, and Mark's covered a few of those elements when he's spoken earlier, but I'm going to be digging deeper down into the people element. So obviously, given the coronavirus, there is a huge impact that's being had across our employees. And I'm sure many of us would all agree that keeping our people safe is one of the most important things, or if not the most important things that businesses need to be considering and doing, in addition to planning for how they maintain viable. So the things that I want to talk about in health and safety cover from signs and symptoms, what you do in that situation. We're going to cover off a little bit around travel. We're also going to talk about meetings and gatherings inside the work environment. And we're going to talk more in detail about working from home from a health and safety point of view. So some of these things that you should really be thinking about is signs and symptoms. So have you had a really good think about what you would do in your organization and have a plan for if an employee turns up to work either feeling sick or describes a situation where they may have had contact with someone who is either positive for coronavirus or maybe positive or is undergoing tests. Being really clear and acting with some level of assertiveness in these situations is really important. So one of the things you really need to consider is what is your role and what are you going to do if that occurs. Also, we've got in there, do you have a plan for when people turn up sick? This is so important at this point because while this is a pandemic and there's a high level of anxiety around coronavirus, there's still potential that people may feel that they may not be exhibiting the symptoms that have been shared on state government and Queensland Health websites, and they still turn up sick. So how are you going to manage that? The other one around health and safety is around welfare support plans. So you would have experienced from speaking to your people and maybe even yourself that this is uncharted territory for us, and people are responding to this in many different ways. It's very natural and that people are feeling panic and anxiety. Have you considered in your organisation what your strategy is and what supports are available for those people? Some organisations have connections to off-site counselling programs, but if you don't, what are the other ways that you're going to make sure your people are supported throughout this? We move along and think about travel. Now, this one is a little bit less relevant given the recent announcement by the Prime Minister yesterday in the federal government, but still you probably should be thinking about your travel policy anyway, because now's a good time to do a refresh. Even if it's not about the travel policy, what about developing a travel register? So having a good view of what your people have done, say in the last 3 months as far as travel, pulling something together like that might be useful. Also, the plan for employees returning from overseas, again, is very clear based on the directive from the Prime Minister. Now's an opportunity for businesses to fall in line and align behind that directive. So reinforcing some of the directives that have been put forward by the federal government. Obviously, if there is a need to travel, it goes without saying, especially domestically, and even not using airlines, is thinking about how you track and monitor where people are going and the movements of your people. The other areas that we want to talk about is if you do have situations where your organisation is still having people working inside offices, you need to have a bit of a think about, from a health and safety point of view, how you plan for either people or visitors entering your location. Some of the things that we're seeing in some of the organisations we're working with at the moment around this is they're describing rooms or meeting rooms as clean rooms or dirty rooms. And what I mean by that is a clean room is a room that's been sanitised. A dirty room is a room that has been used for a meeting but has not yet been sanitised. And the ways that they're categorising that is as simple as a flip chart in front of the door, or even in some cases just a whiteboard and whiteboard marker, letting people know that this meeting room was used recently and it's not been yet sanitised. So having a bit of a plan for that is really important. But the best way is, if you can, and this is very much dependent on the organisation that you work in, your business, is where possible moving to the virtual meeting point of view. So that's where we start to leap into the working from home. So working from home and health and safety this is not a new idea or a new concept. We are very much being forced and thrust into the future of work with virtual meetings, virtual workshops, people working from home. But there is definitely a health and safety element that needs to be considered in this space as well. So have you got policies around how employees are kept safe while working from home? Are these up to date? Are employees across what is in these documents? There's some of the things you need to be considering. In addition, you also need to have a view of the insurances and what coverage may be provided. Again, this is going to vary between organisation to organisation, but now's the time, as you're going through and planning for all these things, whether it be how you deal with signs and symptoms, travel, how meetings occur, and working from home, is probably a really good time to go through your list of policies, have a look, understand which policies are relevant given the situation we're in, identify gaps if there are some, write those, and also make your employees aware of the relevant policies. Right, the next one is looking more broadly at people. And so there's a couple of things I'm going to cover here. And the first is more connected to strategic workforce planning. And the other one is a little bit about some advice on how we can really step up into leadership over this period of crisis. So when we think about people and we think about strategic workforce planning, especially in the scenario or the situation we are in at the moment, what we're really asking ourselves at the base level, and also should be something you should be considering, is who are the right people in the right place at the right time doing the right things for my business. So that's your true north when you're thinking about your business, sustainability, and how you remain commercial. So let me break that down for you a little bit. So once you've got that true north, there's 3 levels of questions you may want to be asking yourself. Then this sort of expands on a little bit on what Mark has spoken about in sustainability. So the first thing you need to do is look at your organisation or your business and ask yourself, what are the critical services that you provide? So another way of thinking about this is, what are all the things that your business does? What of those things are absolutely critical for you to maintain and keep the lights on, so to speak, in your business, and what are non-critical? So once you've identified the absolute critical services, the next question you need to ask yourself is, who are the people or teams that deliver these critical services? So within these teams, there are roles, there are people, there may be a number of people in your organisation that contribute to the critical services. You need to identify those people and think about what are the baseline people you require. Once you've got an idea of your critical roles and your critical people, you need to dig a bit deeper into the critical roles in relation to skills and capabilities. So think of it like this. Have you got people in your organisation that have certain skills or capabilities that are hard to find in the marketplace? This may be experienced by when this person goes on annual leave, you may really struggle to find people to step up into that role. You need to identify these people in your organization, and you need to start putting plans in place as to how you protect these people, because they start to become very critical single points of failure for you. So for example, some of the things that we're seeing with businesses we're working with at the moment around this have been identifying these critical roles. Then they've gone and spoken to these people and found out that potentially they travel to work by public transport. Because their role is so critical to delivery of the critical services, some businesses have organised either car services or organised car parks for them at locations and ask them to drive their own car instead of public transport. That's a strategy to ensure that people who are critical to your business, who are critical to your services, are able to stay away from the illness. So that's one example. So right now, if you've gone through those 3 steps, what you've basically got is your most skeleton staff and workforce delivering your most important and critical services. So in other words, this is the bare minimum, what you need to survive. Now you need to start planning for different scenarios and setting thresholds and working out what the plans are. So this again is going to be really different depending on your organization, your business, your context. And as Mark has said earlier, one of the real challenges with the pandemic that we're facing is that there is going to be a prolonged period. So it becomes really important to be thinking about fatigue and how you start to rotate through. So let me give you some examples. If you think about your business right now, or maybe not right now, let's minus 2 months. What is BAU for your business? That is your standard workforce. That is everybody doing their roles in your business. Now you've gone through those 3 questions. Now you have your most skeleton staff. So next thing you need to think about is what are the thresholds and what are the plans around how you move so that when you get down to your most critical workforce, critical services, you know where you're sitting. So the plans that you may want to think about is, are there things that you can do now with regards to critical people in relation to training, in relation to upskilling and building capability? So while you may not be at your skeleton staff, there may be a likelihood that you may be there within the next 2, 3, 4 weeks, maybe later. So the opportunity now is start to identify them, start to put together what we call a batting order. So you have the first person, and if that person goes down, who steps in? If that person goes down, who steps in? And then start being really creative about the strategies you're going to employ here. Because one of the things that you need to consider is, are there people who have recently left the organization, who are recently retired, who have certain skills and capabilities you might be able to draw on? Are there people, if you're in an operational context, who have moved from operational into more of the corporate side, but used to work in the operational context, that you can pull out of the corporate and place them into the operational piece? So it's really about being really clear about who your people are, what their capabilities are, and how you can move people around to cover holes when you need them. So there's some of the workforce planning pieces that we've sort of covered off there. Now let's get into one of the real opportunities around being leaders of business and leadership. And there's 2 things I want to cover, because I'm sure there's a lot of information out there that you can consult to. But I think there's 2 things. I want to try to keep it really simple. If you're a leader of your organization, there are 2 things you need to be thinking of. That is, how do you communicate and how do you set the tone? So when I think about communication, now's the time for leaders to be very clear about what the communication strategy is, how they align to messages that are out there in the general public. Consider the tone of your voice. How do you make sure you remain calm and cool, collected when you're talking to your staff, when inside you're actually feeling anxious and under pressure? These are some of the things that us as leaders we need to be doing and considering when we're working with our workforce. The other thing that we need to think about is the channels of communication. This is a really good opportunity to think about communication beyond emails, beyond Yammer. sometimes it's not only the channels, but how it's communicated. So sometimes a phone call from a leader as a check-in is far more powerful than people putting a health status update on a shared forum. So really have those thoughts about you as a leader and what you're doing in that space. And the last one is sort of a sum up of all of those. We all know that culture is set by what leaders do and say. Okay, so now's the opportunity for you as leaders in your business to set the culture now, and or maybe even take a reset and move it forward once we move on from the pandemic. You know, the reality is that there are people out there where there's a lot of ambiguity and they're looking for direction. And if you hold a leadership position, my belief, it's part of your role and it's part of your responsibility to provide direction and to be that stable element of the business. And the final thing about the leadership is, if all else fails, if there's nothing you remember in relation to leadership, is you need to walk the talk. So if you're setting directives about working from home, if you're asking your people to do certain things, you need to be willing to do those things as well. So set the example by walking the talk. Excellent. So that brings us to the end of the more formal element of the webinar. What we're going to do now is, throughout that the last sort of 31 minutes, we've been receiving a lot of question and answers have been coming through, and thanks to the team that have been supporting us on the other side. And Mark and I are going to sort of go through, and we've got a few notes here being passed to us about certain questions that are coming in, and we're going to answer those questions now. While we're doing that, I'll also just take the opportunity to quickly direct you to the website. There's a whole plethora of materials in there that you may be able to access while we're going through this, and yeah, take a look at that. That's the www.bdo.com.au/COVID-19. And as Mark said at the start, all of our responses to these questions that we answer will be captured, but also the questions that we don't get to in this time will also be followed up with afterwards. We've got a broad network of people across BDO that can provide expertise. So if we don't answer your question now, it'll come when we send through the webinar link and the aftercare pack.
Okay, Joe, we've got a question here from Julie in Queensland. Julie wants, her question is, we employ 14 staff with no coronavirus plan in place. Do we need to have a plan?
Okay, so this is a really good question. There may be some people on the call who do run smaller businesses, and obviously the question is, do we need to have a plan in place? Well, I think the answer here is, well, it's good to have a plan. So regardless of the business that you run, even though the planning is not essential, so let's assume in this situation that these 14 people can work from home. That in itself requires a plan. It requires a plan around technology, it requires a plan around health and safety, it requires a plan around how you're going to keep people motivated, distribution of work. So the short answer is yes, you need a plan, even with a smaller workforce. And now's the time to actually plan how you will actually do these things and what you need to do. So I think the short answer there is planning is very important. I would definitely recommend having a plan, even with the 14-person staff.
Yep, cool.
Right. I think we've got one coming across here for you now, Mark. Okay, so this is from Bruno in Queensland. The question is, what topics should business continuity plans address?
Well, hopefully my webinar helped a little way to do that.
Yeah.
But look, I think at the end of the day, with business continuity planning, it's really important that it's fit for purpose and fit for your organisation, a bit like the previous question around 14, I've got 14 staff. So we would not be recommending that you put all the things in place, you know, if you're a health system that you would need for a business continuity plan that you would do for a smaller business. So I think my guide on that is it always has to be fit for purpose. Now, there are a number of templates available via the internet, but, you know, BDO has resources and information on that. So I guess, you know, if you you want to make contact down the track, we can obviously provide some support around providing some templates. But I guess generally the areas that probably should be covered from a BCP is your general administration and making sure that you've got those sort of things in train. Looking at your continuity framework, so basically how is the plan positioned in your organisation and making sure that's well communicated. Really understanding, as you spoke about, Joe, and I think I have earlier today, around those business processes, listing all those business processes, but really focusing on those critical ones. But with the business process, it's also about understanding the impacts and the threats to those processes, and we talked about things like supply chain. Continuity planning as well is probably key, detailed planning and responsibilities for those processes that are in place. And other areas I think we need to consider are probably things like who are the key contacts, suppliers, and communication. I had a former boss that said, you've got to do the 3 C's, communicate, communicate, communicate. So I think through this time of uncertainty, communication is definitely key. So Joe, I think we've got another question come through, have we? Yep. This one is from Alex in South Australia. Alex wants to know, what is the status of business continuity insurance cover for COVID-19 interruptions?
Okay, so I'm going to probably say off the bat that I am not an insurance specialist, but like I said, we've got a big team working around us at the moment, and they're helping me out with the response here. So I think with anything, it's around recommending that you review your current insurance policies, and you need to be really clear on what your insurance policy covers and what it does not. And an easy way to do that, if it's available to you, is to actually talk to your insurers. Now, one of the things that we know that the Australian Council of Australia on the 11th of March has declared COVID-19 an insurance catastrophe. So business interruption insurance have included general inclusion clauses from the 2005, 2006 to exclude losses relating to quarantinable losses. But you may have specialist cover. So review the policies and seek advice from your insurers. And that's also one of the questions that on the takeaway we'll build a little bit more information around and maybe direct you to some sources that may be useful.
Okay, so Joe, you're running hot right now, and this is a little bit more in your expertise. I think it's more a people advisory type one. So Kira Lee, also in Queensland, has a question. Where do employers stand in relation to offloading employers to ensure our business stays afloat? We don't have the cash flow to pay out redundancies due to the instant drop in income. Pretty good question.
Look, it is, and this is one of the real challenges with the environment we're in at the moment. It's in relation to business owners and leaders considering the commercial element of their business, but also the people element, and how do you balance those two things? Look, I think the first thing that I'll say with regards to offloading or making people redundant, again, this is very much dependent on the employee contracts, the EBAs, and the Fair Work legislation around who you employ. So obviously the first thing you'd be checking is with your HR team or legal to understand the rights around that. So let me just get that out of the way. But let me go through my advice on this before you even need to think about offloading. We know that in most organizations, there are different types of leave that people can take, okay? So what I would be doing if I was a business owner where I had potential challenges around cash flow is I'd be having conversations with my employees. I'd be bringing them in and explaining them the situation, especially if they're people that have either A, been with you for a long time, if they're people that are really fundamental to your business, and also pretty importantly, if they're people who contribute to your culture. Surely your first thought has to be around how do we keep these people employed, right? So I think that one of the things that I've seen work really well, and we saw this quite a bit after the GFC, is sit down with your staff and talk about types of leave. So for example, there may be people with large amount of recreational leave. One way is to ask them to take that rec leave. Another way might be to consider creating a special leave, asking your employees to take leave without pay. These are all things and conversations you can have with your people. I just think that before you move to offloading employees to keep your business afloat, you may want to sit down with them and see if together you can come up with a joint solution. Because remember, while you may be offloading or moving people out of your business to stay afloat, the cost of rehiring people down the track will probably negate some of the perceived financial gains that you've made by moving employees on. So just keep that in mind. But that's a really good question.
Yeah, look, I think no, look, your speech today is obviously more important than mine because there's another question come through for you, Joe.
Okay.
This one's from Patricia. I know. Is it, what am I on to now? Is it Patricia? Yeah, Patricia from South Australia. That question?
Yeah, sure.
So Patricia wants to know, what do we do to access funds from government if workers are ill and off work and no one can take their place?
Okay, so this is one that the team had to do some searching on this one. Look, what we've come up with is that we're not immediately aware of any existing relief for this circumstance. In the normal course, as we know, normal business, if a worker is sick, an employee will need to pay, the employee in accordance with their employment terms, and then obviously or potentially hire additional staff on the basis that they need to. I think this is one where it's a little bit tricky because, as Mark said about some of the government and the government funding, things are sort of starting to roll out bit by bit. If you're based in Queensland, Premier Palaszczuk's, talking about some of the things that the state government is working on to support people and businesses. So I think this is a watch this space. I'd probably direct you to the state and federal government websites, and that's something that we'll probably, with this one, bring in when we send the pack out at the end. But I think it's a good question, but it's a tricky one to answer at the moment. All right, I've had enough of talking on the people. Looks like one's come in for you, Mark, and this is from Gina. So this seems like a tech question. So the question is, do you have any specific examples of apps that are helpful to use to communicate to staff? I'm especially thinking of using something like today's webinar to communicate with staff who work in our factory and operations and who are not in an office job.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Gina. And I suppose getting back to the whole fit for purpose, element that we've been talking around business continuity planning. Hopefully, the business continuity planning stuff that we've discussed today can be, I guess, modified to suit most businesses across Australia. But the answer, for me, I think is I would be recommending using a range of technologies for contingency, so not relying on one particular piece of technology. Obviously, you've got the email and the intranet websites, but we've also found things like Microsoft products like Microsoft Teams and Skype for Business, and they've been really useful for communicating and staying in touch with the workforce. But yeah, like the webinar and recording yourself on a video and sending them to the staff is another great way of keeping that communication open. And I guess a touch back a little bit on Joe's conversation before around leadership and making sure that you're walking the talk and you're visible and you're providing that direction. So that's a really good area to be focusing on. And given that they are hosted away from your sites and in factories, and that they obviously remain reliable, the technology needs to remain reliable, but also be ready for SMS and phone communications to suppliers and staff as well. So a lot of our clients, I guess, are using other tools around SMS and other pieces. So Joe, back to you. There's a question that's come through from Elisa in Queensland, or Alyssa, I think, yep. How do managers maintain high levels of productivity when teams are working remotely? Well, that's a tough one.
It is, and it's an interesting one, right? So I made reference to the future of work, and in reality, depending on the role, a lot of us, especially in corporate, have been working from home probably for the last 10 or 15 years. So, but now we're talking about productivity because we've got large volumes of our workforce working from home. So I guess when you think about the high levels of productivity, you need to think in the things that we're doing. So just to give you some context, here at BDO, while Mark and I and a small team at the moment are in the office today,
A clean office.
a very clean office, we're working with our staff. We've directed our staff to work from home, and with that brings certain challenges. But some of the strategies we're employing are things like holding morning huddles. So that is like a quick check-in in the morning using some of the software that Mark spoke about, whether it be Microsoft Teams or Skype for Business, and doing like a virtual check-in. And that's just seeing where people are, what they're up to for the day, that sort of thing. The other ways that you can keep people and sort of engaged and productive is to share achievements. So you might want to set up an achievement board, right? So again, depending on your business, that might be a place where people, like a virtual sort of post-it note where somebody might share an achievement for the day. The other one as well is, and it takes a little bit more creativity, is around maybe gamify aspects of the work if possible. So are there ways that you can gamify elements of the work, leaderboards, things like that, things that keep people motivated, get that peak up. So I think that there's some certain strategies that you can do with working from home, but I think that you've got to balance the productivity with regards to also the human connection, right? So there is going to be, this is not a working from home 1 day a week. This is some of our team have been working from home really since Monday, and some of our team may be we may be working from home or doing remote working for another 4 weeks. That's a very different scenario than working from home 1 or 2 days a week. So I think that just as much as you keep an eye on productivity, you also need to be really considering social isolation and how you're managing that. So with this one, it's almost like going back to old school and picking up the phone and ringing people, checking in on people. I actually also think I've seen a lot more of a sort of acceptance of using video messaging now. So I used to run quite a few phone calls, and I'd always be one of those people with my video turned off, but sort of participating in the call. I'm seeing a lot more people being more comfortable with their videos because that's showing their interaction, allowing people to talk.
So Joe, just while you're on that theme, one's just come through, which I think is very similar, and I think you might have touched on it to a large degree, but Rachel wants to know, if you run a small business and have some personnel who can work from home, do you recommend to have all employees who can to work from home if their job allows it?
Ultimately, this is your call, Rachel. On this one, I'm going to go on the side of what we're seeing, the advice from state and federal government, where the recommendation is around social distancing. So I believe that if an employee can work from home, or your staff can work from home and they can be productive from home, and you're able to provide the supports from health and safety, and they're doing their bit for to keep the virus contained by social distancing, I would definitely recommend it. The only thing that I'd say to that, and also the last question, is there's a large number of people in our workforce today, given we're seeing 4 generations of workforce coming together. There's a lot of digital natives. So for some people, using Skype for Business and using technology to communicate is secondhand. But there's also a large number of people who are not comfortable with technology. I think in this scenario, Rachel, I think you or any other business, I think it's fairly reasonable to check in with your team and see if they need additional support on how to use technology, because it can also be, can contribute to that social isolation if people are not able to, use technology effectively. So keep an eye on that. Okay, Mark, we've got one for you. And wow, we've got this international one. So this is Mel, and she's from Ontario in Canada. And the question is, hi Mel, if you're on the line, by the way, can you address potential for transmission via inanimate services like mail, packages, courier tracking services, devices, and the length of time in which the virus can remain active?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I guess you can address the potential for transmission via those services that you've mentioned, Mel. I'm not a medical expert I don't have a PhD in front of my name, but if we focus on the measures that we are seeing, BDO and others that we're putting in place. So I think, Joe spoke about it pretty well before around additional cleaning and the disinfection of workspaces. And as we were saying before, we're seeing some of our clients swapping work locations and making sure they know which areas are clean and which ones are obviously dirtier. I think it's really important as the health advice has come through about limiting human to human interaction, the handshaking, the fist pumping. I think, it feels a bit weird here in Australia to do that sort of stuff because we're handshakers, but they're the sorts of things that are going to help, I guess, manage and we talked about really at the start of the webinar around flattening out that curve so that our health systems aren't being bombarded all at once. And we're going to get sick, I think, at the end of the day, and most people are getting over it pretty quickly. It's obviously impacting those in our community and our workforce, which we need to be careful of, that are the older generations or have some sort of immunity challenges. And so I guess, as we've been talking about, the working remotely where possible and using video conferencing and other tech is paramount.
Okay, it seems like we've got another one coming in.
So Joe, this one, I think I'm going to throw this to you because I think it's more in your space than mine, hopefully. This one's from Lisa in WA, not nearly as far as Canada when you think about it.
Yeah.
What measures do you put in place for clients coming into your building that could potentially be infected?
Yeah, okay, so we sort of covered a little bit of this in the seminar, in the webinar, sorry. Obviously, the first thing is I would be asking is, it depends what types of business you're running. I'm assuming this is a business where people do need to continue coming to your site. So some of the things that I've seen in other organisations is being really clear on, with signs on the door, which say things like, if you're exhibiting these symptoms, reminders about hand hygiene. So basically, before people enter your premise, giving them an opportunity to self-select out. There's also, we spoke about the sanitise and the cleaning the dirty rooms. I think it's about doing those things. Ultimately, it's maybe even what we're seeing a little bit is how people are being, if possible, screened at certain times with regards to fever. And even if you do have to have people come to your business about maintaining safe distances, it's actually quite interesting. One of the things I noticed on the way into work this morning is I was walking along the sidewalk and there were 4 people who were literally talking to each other, but standing, I reckon, around 1.5 meters away. And I had to walk straight in between them. And what I realised as I was walking in between these people, because there was a large enough space for me, that they were actually having a meeting on the side of the road, but they were doing it at a safe distance. So
cool.
Maybe that's the new normal.
So I think, look, we've got one last question, which I think most of it's already been, sorry, I've just got 2, but we're gonna have to wrap it up after that, I think, guys, because we're getting to the end of the hour allocated. But this one's from Matthew. And so Matthew's, he's conscious of trying to keep a team culture in a virtual environment. Do you have any tips, suggestions on how activities we can do that work in a virtual environment to sort of improve that or maintain that culture?
Look, Matthew, I think you're probably not going to like my answer, because I actually think that doesn't matter whether it's a virtual environment or an environment people face to face. I think there might have to be some tweaks, but for me, keeping and maintaining a team culture is always about working with people, listening to people, providing opportunities for people to have input into what they're doing, providing opportunities for autonomy, for giving feedback, and having some connectiveness. So I think that if you're naturally good at maintaining a maintaining a fairly positive team culture, I think that all you need to do is just move those things into a digital and virtual place. So, you know, at the end of a meeting, if you're doing a team meeting on Skype for Business, there might be an opportunity to say, hey, Mark, can you stay on the line after everyone jumps on and off and have a check-in? The same way you would if you as a leader were having a meeting with the team and you notice something that maybe wasn't right. So I think it's more about keep on doing what you're doing. Don't feel like the technology or the virtual piece is a barrier. It's just a different communication mode and a different way of working. So yeah, I think just continue doing what you're doing, and just make sure you're now more than ever is keeping in touch with your employees. All right, here is the last question, and this one is for Mark. So this is from Loretta, and her question is, are there any planned templates? I am in the aged care sector.
The short answer is yes. I guess it's about making sure it's fit for purpose. Obviously, have experience in the aged care sector. So what might be best on this one, Loretta, is that we've got your details from the webinar. We might reach out and have a discussion one-on-one around what that requirement might look like and how we might be able to support you with a template moving forward. So I think that sort of got us to the last of the questions.
Yep, and I think my last comment, Mark, before we close off would be, I just want to say two things more broadly. The first one is what I spoke about, mental health and anxiety. I think that we need to be really cognizant that this is very uncharted territory and there's a lot of anxiety around what is happening at the moment. We've covered a lot of content in detail, but you need to be checking in on people and seeing how they are. And it is very likely that there's anxiety and people are struggling. So you need to be able to provide them with support, but also direct them to areas of support. The other thing that I want to share is, and I know we might have some people from outside of Australia, which is fine on this call, but this is a really good time for us to be thinking about other people, right, and showing kindness for other people. There are plenty of people in this country that this is going to have dramatic impact to their life and how they operate and what's going on at home. So I just encourage everybody on the call, if there is an opportunity for you to show kindness, support to somebody else, even people you know or don't know, now's the time for us to get together and really show that kindness, because this is going to be a bit prolonged and we just need to make sure that we're supporting the most vulnerable people in our society.
Totally agree. Really good points, Joe. And look, thank you for everybody's attendance on the webinar today. Please contact Joe or myself if we can assist you or your organisation in relation to any business continuity planning responses that you have in mind. Obviously, BDO is going to provide a copy of this webinar shortly, and we'll add to it any other questions that have popped in. But once again, we've got that BDO coronavirus page there on the screen. Please check those resources and stay well, everybody. Thank you.